now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. David Rubenstein is co-founder and co-CEO of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest private equity firms that manages more than $200 billion from 35 offices around the globe. David was born and raised in Baltimore and attended Duke University, where he became a 1970 magna cum laude graduate and elected Phi Beta Kappa. Mr. Rubenstein also has great ties to Chicago, as he graduated in 1973 from the University of Chicago Law School, where he was an editor of the Law Review. From 1977 to 1981, during the Carter administration, Mr. Rubenstein was Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. After his White House service, he practiced law in Washington until 1987, where he co-founded the Carlyle Group. In addition to his work with investments and private equity, Mr. Rubenstein is actively involved in philanthropy, serving as chairman of the boards of trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and Duke University, a regent of the Smithsonian Institution, and co-chair of the Brookings Institution, vice chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, a trustee of the National Gallery of Art, and president of the Economic Club of Washington. He is also on the board of trustees, directors or trustees for the University of Chicago, the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts, the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Johns Hopkins Medicine, and the Institute for Advanced Study, the National Museum of American History of the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Museum of Natural History of the Smithsonian Institution.
Well, thank you very much for that kind and overly generous introduction. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. This reminds me of my bar mitzvah because I haven't had so many people who want to see me since my bar mitzvah. So thank you very much. How many people think I should be a rap star? Anybody? How many think opera? Well, on the rap, what actually happened is we were trying to do a deal with Dr. Dre, and to be honest, my favorite musician and performer is probably Frank Sinatra. That's about how hip I am. I'd never heard of Dr. Dre. But they said because I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center, maybe I could persuade Dr. Dre to do a deal with us, and they trotted me out to meet with him. We spent 2 hours, and he didn't really say much. He had his partner doing most of the talking. And then he got up, and he is big. He's 6'4", and he's looked, sculpted. And I said, well, you look like you exercise a lot. He says, yes, 4 hours a day. He said, how much do you do? I said, 4 hours a year. He said he didn't believe I did that much. So we did the deal, and it worked out quite well, and they wanted us to do a rap takeoff on it, and so they hired a young African-American rap star, I guess, in Washington to be my coach, and they said, it'll take you 5 minutes to come over and film it in Washington. So I went over. 4.5 hours later, we finished, and the man then said to me, Mr. Rubenstein, you are the whitest man I've ever met in my life. And he was right. So how many people here are natives of Chicago? Okay. How many people moved to Chicago later? Okay. How many people think Chicago is the greatest city in the United States? Okay. How many think the Economic Club of Chicago is the best economic club in the United States? Okay. Okay. How many people here think that the economy is heading into a slowdown period? Okay. How many people think the economy is going to get better from here? Okay. How many people here think the federal government is going to solve any problems we have? How many people think your taxes are going up? Okay, how many people think your employer will pay you additional amounts to cover those taxes? Okay, one here. Oh, these are the Carlyle people, right. They're not right, but okay. And I'm just, before I get into what I wanted to say, before we get into the Q&A, how many people here, I'm just curious, how many people here thought Barack Obama would be elected President of the United States, be honest, before 2008? How many people thought that? Okay. How many people here now think that the next President of the United States will be Hillary Clinton? Okay. How many think it'll be Bernie Sanders? Larry David? Well, how many people think it'll be Ted Cruz? Wow. How many think it'll be Donald Trump? Okay. How many think it'll be Jeb Bush? How many people think it'll be Ben Carson? John Kasich? Geez. How many people think it'll be Mike Bloomberg. Anybody? Okay, who? How many think, I'm getting to him, how many think it should be Marco Rubio? It will be, okay? How many people think the next president should be a private equity professional? No, anybody? All right, how many people think private equity is the highest calling of mankind? Anybody? Okay. So I am a private equity professional, and I do think that private equity is perhaps the highest calling of mankind. And I came to this decision late in life, and let me just tell you how I got there. And well, the story I'm going to tell you is a story that some of you may find compatible with your own lives. So my name is David Rubenstein, and if your last name is Rubenstein, you think the person probably has a father who was a nice Jewish lawyer or doctor or dentist or something. But I like to remind people there are blue-collar Jews, and my father was one of them. I grew up in Baltimore. My father dropped out of high school to go into the Marines in World War II. He came back, he met my mother. My mother was 17 when they got married. My father was 19. I was born more than 9 months later. I'm the only child, and my father worked in the post office his entire life, made about $10,000 at the peak. And so I realized that at the time I thought it might be a disadvantaged upbringing, but it was actually turned out to be a great advantage to have two loving parents with unconditional love, which is most thing you could get from a parent, and having material resources wasn't that important. Now I actually think that children who grow up with fathers who are very wealthy may have a disadvantage. If you have parents who unconditionally love you and you don't have money, it's a great advantage. And I didn't realize it at the time, but now I realize it. But I realized I had to make it on my own. And I got a scholarship to go to Duke University. It wasn't a basketball scholarship, I can assure you. I was the only person in Duke's history who got cut from an intramural basketball team with only 4 other people on the team. And so I got a scholarship to go to law school. I wanted to go to law school, and I was growing up. The biggest transformative thing in my life was in the 6th grade, John Kennedy gave his great inaugural address. Some of you may remember it. It was a brilliant speech given in 14 minutes. It was the greatest speech he ever gave, I think the best inaugural address of the 20th century. And my teacher went over that line by line, word by word, and it was really poetry in prose form. And it just instilled in me the idea that maybe the most important thing was to give back to your country and try to do public service. And in those days, that's what I really wanted to do. So I thought if I became a lawyer, I would go into government and do public service and give back to my country. And that was my real goal in life. So I went to law school thinking I would go into government service and work in Capitol Hill or maybe work in the administration. I didn't intend to come to Chicago. I'd never been to Chicago. I applied to a lot of law schools, and I was fortunate to get into them. But University of Chicago had a policy then to get people from the East and West Coast to come to the Midwest, I guess. And so they offered me a full scholarship. And I said, okay, that's great. My parents probably couldn't have afforded law school. And they said, you just fill in your $50 and you send in your $50 and you get your full scholarship. You'll show up here. Just reserve your place. I then got a letter from the university saying, if you want your housing, student dorms, send in $50. Well, not having a lot of money, I sent in the $50 for the housing, thinking the housing people would talk to law school people, telling them I was coming. Didn't work that way. So I showed up in the law school, and they said, your scholarship was given away because you didn't send in your $50. We didn't reserve you. And I said, well, why would I have needed the law school dorm if I wasn't coming? They said, it's a different department, and that doesn't work that way. So I started crying, and they felt sorry for me. And a woman who was working at the law school came out. I think her name was Ann Barber, and she said, oh, we figured things out, and we will give you the scholarship. And I was very grateful, and I've given them $20 million in scholarship money to make up for it. So it's a good investment. But and I never forget it was a great law school. Bob Zimmer is here, and he's a great president of the university. He's done a terrific job. The university's in very good shape. I'm proud to be a board member. But I was nervous that I wasn't going to get a good law school education because the first year they had a young man came in and was teaching us torts. And he had this thing about economic theory of torts. And I just said, this guy is going to make it possible for me to fail the bar exam because I'm not going to know what torts law is. It was Richard Posner. And has he gone on to do anything else in Chicago lately? I don't know. He was a great professor and obviously a great judge and so forth. And I had a great education. And what I wanted to do was to go into public service. And so I ultimately went to work for a firm in New York called Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison because the partner there was named Ted Sorensen, a partner who had written John Kennedy's inaugural address with President Kennedy. And I thought maybe some of his luster would rub off on me. I started practicing law for a few years. It was clear, my client said to me, what are you going to do other than practicing law? It was clear I wasn't a great lawyer. The people in the firm suggested maybe I do something else as well. So Ted Sorensen, trying to help the firm, got me a job in Washington with a man who said he would be next president of the United States. I went to work for him. His name was Birch Bayh. He didn't become president in 1976. He dropped out of his campaign 30 days after I joined it. So I said, uh-oh, I wasn't a great lawyer, and my political acumen wasn't very good. And then, as may have happened to you, I got a call out of the blue from somebody I didn't know. And he said, would you like to interview with somebody else? I said, who? Jimmy Carter. Isn't he the peanut farmer from Georgia? Yes. Well, I had nothing else to do. I interviewed, I got the job, and I went to work there. And when I joined Jimmy Carter's campaign, he was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford. When I was finished, Carter won by 1 point. So Carter often said, what was your qualification for, helping me? And anyway, as we all have learned, White House staffs are often filled not on merit, but also who worked in the campaign. So I worked in the campaign, and at the age of 27, I became the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the President of the United States, a job I wasn't qualified for, but I figured Carter wasn't qualified either. Nobody was qualified. I managed to get, one of my responsibilities was to get inflation down. I got it down to 19%, very hard to do. Nobody's done it since. There was a rumor that if Carter was reelected, I was going to be the senior domestic advisor, and at the age of 31 would have the same job that Ted Sorensen had under President Kennedy. On the strength of that rumor, President Carter thinks he lost the election. So this may have happened to you too. One day I'm riding around Air Force One, Marine One, going to Camp David. I'm advising the President of the United States. The next day I'm out of a job. And nobody wanted to hire an ex-Carter White House aide. So it took me many, many, many months to convince somebody to hire me because I had no expertise. Nobody really cared how the Carter White House worked. So finally I started practicing law again. And ultimately, the law firm said the same thing that Paul Weiss had said. Why don't you consider something else? And I got the hint. My clients, I said to them, I might do something else. And they said, good idea. So I realized I wasn't a great lawyer. And to be great at anything, you have to love it. Nobody's ever won a Nobel Prize hating what they do. Nobody's ever done anything great working 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You have to love it so much you have a passion for it, and I didn't love it. So I decided to start the first private equity firm in Washington, and I was inspired to do so because I had read that if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have to start something between the age of 28 and 37. It's not unlike a woman's biological time clock. After the age of 37, your chance of reproducing goes down, and after the age of 37, your chance of starting a company goes down. And I read that when I was 37. So I said, okay. So I recruited 3 people who knew something about leveraged buyouts, and I was going to do some legal work, and ultimately we started Carlyle in 1987. And it took off for lots of reasons and grew to be a very large firm. And then when I was 54 years old, I read in Forbes magazine what my purported net worth was. And it was somewhat embarrassing, and my children were somewhat shocked because I hadn't really told them much about our success. And then I realized that, and I read something else around that time, that on average, a white male at 54 will, on average, there's some obviously exceptions, will probably make it to 81 or 82 or 83. And I realized then I had lived 2/3 of my actuarial life, and I had accumulated a lot of money. And I said, okay, what am I going to do with this money? I can be buried with it like the ancient pharaohs in Egypt, but there's no evidence you really need it in the afterlife. Maybe you do, but there's no evidence of it. I could let my executor give it away, and maybe I'd be watching from some place where it was going, but I wasn't sure I was going to be in the right place to watch it. So I decided I would give it all away. And Bill Gates called me around that time and said, would you like to sign this giving pledge? And I became the only person in the private equity world to sign it at the time. And there were about 40 of us. A number in Chicago have signed it as well. And I basically set out to kind of give away my money. And like many of you, I've gotten involved in philanthropy and very fortunate to do so. Though I like to remind people that philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. So you can give your time, your energy, your ideas, and so forth. And I've done a lot in educational matters and medical research and performing arts. But one thing happened to me that changed my life, and let me tell you what the story was. I was coming back from London, and I was on a plane, and I was reading my mail, and I was heading to New York that day. I live in Washington, and it happened that night there was an exhibition of the Magna Carta. I said, how can the Magna Carta be here? It just should have been in London, where I just was. So I decided to go and look at the Magna Carta. I'd never seen a Magna Carta. I got there, and the curator from Sotheby's said, actually, there are 17 copies of the Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, 1 in the Australian Parliament, and Ross Perot had bought one, the only one in private hands, and a family had had it for 500 years. They sold it to Ross Perot in 1984. His lawyer went over and got it and put it up in a tube and went through customs. The customs person said, what's in that tube? He said, the Magna Carta. I said, sure, go ahead. And they didn't believe it. So it was taken out of the country without an export license, but Sotheby's was going to sell it, and they told me it was probably going to go to somebody from Russia or Saudi Arabia or South Africa, they told me who the likely buyers were probably going to be from the countries. They didn't name the individuals. And I said, geez, this is a document that inspired our Declaration of Independence and our Bill of Rights, and while it wasn't drafted here, it should be here, and so I want to make sure one copy was here. So I resolved to go back the next night and buy it. And I didn't want to tell my wife because it sounds presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta. And I didn't want to tell my children. They might say, how much less money might this mean for us? So I went back the next night, and I'm not an art collector, and so I really didn't know much about Sotheby's. I went there, and I said, okay, where do I go up and raise my hand? They said, go in this little room. And they put me in a little room. They locked the door, and they put up the telephone. And I couldn't hear that well. The transmission wasn't good. And if anybody been in auction, you start bidding, you get carried away. So I started bidding, and all of a sudden, the guy said, sold. So I figured it meant to somebody. I couldn't hear it. He came into the room, and he said, actually, you bought it. Who are you? We've never seen you before. I told him my name. He said, okay, you have the money for this, right? I said, yes. He said, okay, you can slip out the side door and nobody will ever know, or there are 100 reporters there who would like to know who bought the Magna Carta. And I said, well, I'll go out and tell them. And I went out and said that I have been very fortunate in my life to come from very modest means. I now have the ability to give back to my country, and I wanted to give this to the country as a down payment on my obligation to give back to the country. And so I put it on the National Archives on a permanent loan. It'll be there forever, and when I die, it'll stay there forever. And I got in the habit, and then somebody called me the next day and said, well, if you want to buy Magna Carta, I have one. And then I got lots of people. So I have a standard letter that say I don't want to corner the market of Magna Cartas, but I've since bought some rare copies of other documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, and I put them on display in institutions around the United States so people can see them and maybe appreciate the history of our country, learn the good and the bad. When I bought a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, I had it for many years in the Oval Office, and President Obama was very kind to put it there, and it meant a lot to him because he was a constitutional he was a constitutional law scholar and also, obviously, African American. So I got in that habit, and then something else happens. I wanted to get these documents in people's knowledge because I realized Americans know so little about our history. In a survey by Pew recently, Pew Institute, they asked, what river did George Washington cross during the Revolutionary War? And 35% of Americans said the Rhine River, which happens not to be in our country. About 30% of Americans, when asked who was the first Treasury Secretary, said Larry Summers, which wasn't the case. And about half of Americans in a recent survey could not name the 3 branches of government. And about 25% of Americans in a recent survey couldn't name the Vice President of the United States. And a survey of high school sophomores not long ago by Pew, it turned out that more high school sophomores could name the first 3 names of the 3 Stooges than the first 3 names of any founding fathers. So I try to get people to learn more about our history and the idea that if they learn more, maybe they'll be better informed and we'll have better citizens. And another part of what I've now called patriotic philanthropy arose by accident as well. I came back from Washington from out of town one day, and I saw that there had been an earthquake there. On the Kennedy Center board is the head of the Park Service, John Jarvis. He told me that there had been a lot of damage to the Washington Monument. I said, tell me what it costs. I'll fix it up. I'll pay for it. Forget Congress, forget everybody else because it'll take too long to get it done. Just fix it up. And he said, well, okay, great. I'll figure out what it costs. He came back and told me what it cost. And he said, okay. And I said, okay, get it done. He again called me a couple days later and said, there's a problem. What is it? Well, Congress doesn't get any credit for doing anything good. So they say, could they put up half the money? I said, okay, fine. So they did. And they matched me, and there was good public-private partnership. And you should know, any of you been to the Washington Monument? It's 555 and a half feet. And it's very interesting. When George Washington died, he died in an unusual way. He left the presidency when he was 64 years old. He's at Mount Vernon for 3 years, and he was 67. He was riding around on his horse, inspecting the plantation, comes back dripping wet, and he didn't want to interfere with the guests who were there and be impolite and go upstairs, so he went and sat for 2 hours with his guests. He got sick. The epiglottis in the back of his throat swollen. They called the doctors in. They say the only thing we can do is let the bad spirits out by cutting your veins, which doesn't work. He died not long after. In his will, it said, I don't want to be buried for 2 days. Why would he say that? Because in those days, they tended to bury people alive, and he didn't want to be buried alive. So that's why they had bells in the coffins in those days, and that's where the phrase dead ringer came from. So he, fortunately, I guess, was dead when he was thought to be dead. He was buried, and he was the only founding father who actually freed his slaves upon his death. The only founding father, though he said, upon the death of my wife, they will be freed. So how would you like to be Martha Washington sitting there knowing that So she actually freed the slaves, as she should have, very quickly. It wasn't built for a while. It took many years. There was controversy about George Washington at the beginning. They didn't build it right away. And they ultimately, when they built it, they started a typical Washington project. Started in 1832, finished in 1888. Took 50 years to get it done. When the earthquake damage was done, was being fixed, they put the scaffolding up, and some of you who were in Washington may have seen it. It had beautiful LED lighting and so forth. President Obama said to me at one point, "Can you keep the scaffolding up because the lighting is so great, we see it every night." I couldn't do that. But when the scaffolding was up, they asked if I wanted to go to the top of the Washington Monument on the outside. "You'll never have a chance to do this again," they said. And I said, "Okay." So I get there, and the Secretary of Interior, Sally Jewell, said she would like to go with me. I said, "Okay." She said, "But I'd be humiliated to take that elevator up on the outside." I said, "Well, I wouldn't be humiliated. That's not the only way I'm going to get up there." She said, "No, let's climb. I'm a mountain climber, and I've climbed Mount Rainier 7 times. I said, "Well, I've flown over Mount Rainier 7 times, but I can get up there." So I said, "All right, I'll do it if there's a defibrillator." So they found a defibrillator. We climbed up there. He said it was safe, but they put a harness on me. I don't know how safe it was, but I needed a harness. When I got to the very top, it's the greatest view you're ever going to have in Washington. And when the Secretary of Interior was looking this way and the head of the Park Service was looking this way, I took a pen out and I wrote very top DMR. So if you ever get to the top of the Washington Monument, you'll see some graffiti with my initials there. But I decided that what I would do is try to find other things that should be restored. And I've recently been involved in helping to restore Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home, Montpelier, James Madison's home, the Custis Lee Mansion at the top of Arlington, and the Iwo Jima Memorial in honor of my father, who was a Marine. I did something for Iwo Jima Memorial, and soon I'll do something in honor of President Lincoln that we'll announce, I think, on Lincoln's birthday. So I'm trying to do some things to restore some of these sites, so more people will visit them. So my point of this is not to tell you all the things I've done. I feel very fortunate to be in a position to do this, and I have resolved to give away all my money. My children have, I think, are pretty okay with it. That's what they say, at least. Who knows? But the message I want to give before we get into the part about the economy is really this. Everybody here, by definition, if you are here, you're in the top 1/10 of 1%. And all of you, no doubt, are involved in some philanthropy. But I would like you to think about the idea of what you might be able to do to give back a little bit to your country, as well as other organizations that you might support. All of us are fortunate to be in a country which is very unique. It's had lots of problems. We've had some terrible birth defects at the beginning of our country, and we're still dealing with some of the challenges that are left over from that. And we have lots of other problems, but it's a unique country. And it's one that all of us, I think, are probably proud to live in this country and to be in a position where we have enough financial means to do good things and to live well. And I hope everybody will feel that they could do something so that when you get to the latter stage of your life, you don't look back and say, I wish I had done something to make the world a little bit better, but it's too late to do so. And so I try to encourage students when I talk to them to think early in your life what you can do to make the country a better place. Give back your time, your energy, ideas, because something it will strike your fancy, and something you can do will make this country a slightly better place. And if everybody does that, I think our country can be a much better country than it has been. It's been a great country, and so I encourage everybody to spend some time thinking about what you can do to give back to your country. And if we all do that, I think our country will be a better place. And I think I don't want to be, in my own case, get to my deathbed and say, I wish I had done this. So in my own case, I'm now 66 years old. I do what I'm calling is sprinting to the finish line. I don't know how many more years I have, or my brain or my body will still hold out, but I'm trying to get as many things done as possible. And I encourage everybody not to wait to the end or get to be my age and say, I wish I had done something. Do it when you're earlier and take something and make it your own. It can be something similar to what I've talked about in terms of helping your country, but there's so many ways of helping your country. And I just encourage you all to do that. And most importantly, get your children to do it. Do what you're doing as an example for your children, and make sure when they graduate from college, they don't wait till the end of their life to do something to give back. They try to give something back to their country or their community, but certainly their country at a relatively early age. Let me just conclude before we talk about the economy about one other thing that I've been involved with. John McCarter over here has been very helpful, and I am a regent of the Smithsonian. And the Smithsonian, as you may know, was set up. John is the chairman of it. He used to be the chairman of the Field Museum, and now he's done a great job as the chairman of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian was set up in an unusual way. How many people have ever been to the Smithsonian Museum? Anybody? Okay, as you know, there are about 19 museums and lots of research centers, but the money actually came from a British citizen named James Smithson. He died without any heirs. Ultimately, he left the money to the United States to create an institute for the diffusion of knowledge. The United States government typically didn't want to take the money because they didn't trust anybody from Britain giving money. Finally, they sent somebody over to get it. They brought it back. They promptly put it in Arkansas state bonds. It went bankrupt. No one, the money was lost. But ultimately, through the intervention of John Quincy Adams, who was a member of Congress, they restored the money and they built the Smithsonian Institution. One part of it is the National Zoo. And let me tell you one story about the National Zoo, something I've been involved with there, and it's this. Some of you may remember in 1972, Richard Nixon went to China, and he brought back 2 panda bears. And it turns out that pandas are a very, very endangered species. There are 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth. We're one species. There are 10 million species on the face of the earth. 99% of the species who ever lived are extinct. 1% are left, there are 10 million of us. 7.5 billion humans as one species, but pandas are only 1,300. Now, why are there so few pandas? Well, it turns out that because of God or evolution, depending on your point of view, pandas are unable to reproduce in quite the ways that every other mammal can. And a female goes into estrus only for 4 hours a day, 1 day a year. So think how few people there would be if people could reproduce only 4 hours a day, 1 day a year. So what happens in the wild is the female panda leaves a scent on the tree saying in 3 weeks will be my 4-hour period of time. The male picks it up and he leaves a scent saying I'll be there in 3 weeks. 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, 1 week. They get together. The problem is that the parts don't match very well because they don't know where the parts are supposed to go. They do it so infrequently. So in captivity, what they do is they show movies in China to the pandas. It's called panda porn. But their eyes seem big, but they're actually small, and their brain seems big, but it's actually small, so they don't really get the idea of what to do. So what they have to do is artificially inseminate very often, and in the Washington Zoo, where we have 2 adult pandas, you have to pay the Chinese now roughly $1 million a year. There are 4 zoos in the United States with pandas: Memphis, Atlanta, San Diego, and Washington. And there are 27 in the world that have them, but most of the pandas are still in China, where the only country where they're native to. And when you have artificial insemination, it's more complicated, but it can often work. So you have to pay the Chinese each year $1 million a year. You kind of rent the pandas from the Chinese each year, and the money goes for help for panda reproduction studies. And so because I put up the money to help the Smithsonian on this, they asked if I wanted to come see the artificial insemination. I said, I don't think so. They said, would you like to see the semen extracted from the male? I said, absolutely not. I don't want to see that. So sure enough, they did it without my presence, and as you may have seen recently, we did have a baby panda born, and the First Lady came and was named and so forth. The First Lady of China was there, and the reason I say this is that it reminds me of members of Congress. Members of Congress know what they're supposed to do, but they don't know how to do it. And it's like the pandas. So whenever you see pandas, realize the problem they have, and I hope you have some sympathy for the pandas. They know what they're supposed to do, but they just don't know how to do it. I hope our members of Congress can learn a little bit about getting things done by watching the pandas actually mate a little bit. Thank you very much for that. And let me... So... Before I take some questions, I just want to say that what I would like to talk about, and we'll do it in the question period, is the economy and the investments, and to have a very serious conversation about some serious issue about where the economy is going and where the investment opportunities are.
Well, we have a lot of interesting questions, and thank you very much for those comments. So, in thinking about the economy and investments, so given your extensive travel and deep knowledge and even personal relationship with many of the world leaders, where do you see the most opportunities and risks globally over the coming decade?
Well, okay, in terms of the economy generally. When President Carter was in office, there was an inflation advisor named Fred Kahn. And we went out one time in 1980 when Carter was running for re-election, and he said, I think there's going to be a recession. And Carter called him in the Oval Office and said, don't ever use the R word, because it scares people. I'm running for re-election. So Fred Kahn never used it again, but he used the word banana in the future. He said, we think we might have a banana, because reporters wouldn't write a headline. They would say, Carter's inflation advisor thinks there might be a banana coming. But, to be honest, we have recessions every 7 years in the United States on average since World War II. They last on average about 9 months. The last Great Recession lasted longer. At some point in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll probably have a banana. But I don't know when it's going to come, and I'm not predicting it. Please don't write any headlines saying that Rubenstein says there's going to be a recession at a certain period of time. I don't know when it's going to be. But I do think we are in the beginning stages of an economic slowdown around the world. And the greatest problems that I foresee right now are not just the slowdown, which is inevitable because it happens every so often. These are the biggest problems that I see for the economy. Number one, there is $4 trillion of emerging market corporate debt that is dollar denominated. And if you are in Brazil and you borrow money in dollars and the real has gone down 50% against the dollar, very difficult to think that can be repaid. So all that debt is going to have to be extended or restructured, and that's going to be a big blow, I think, to some parts of the economy. Second, oil prices, being low as they are, have never in the past caused a recession or caused enormous economic problems. But oil prices are so low now and commodity prices are so low that it's begun to affect economies much more than people thought. For example, in our country, when I was in the White House, we had about 5 million barrels of oil a day being produced. Now we're producing at the peak about 9.7 million barrels a day because of fracking producing about half of that. Now that fracking, which probably takes oil at $70, $80 a barrel to make sense, now you can't do it at $30 or $40 a barrel. That's going to slow down, and therefore our industrial sector is going to slow down. 2/3 of the industrial production in our country, growth in industrial production in the last couple of years, has come from the energy sector, and that is really going way down now. So that could be a problem for the whole world, not just us. Another problem is the strength of the dollar. We're the only reserve currency, and everybody else is racing to devalue their currency, and we're not doing that. If anything, ours is going more higher up, and so our ability to export will maybe be more challenged. Another problem we have is that our ability to provide monetary and fiscal stimulus for our economy is very weak now because interest rates are already so low we can't lower them effectively, and also because we've got a budget deal in Congress now that's in place, there's not going to be any fiscal stimulus from the government, and it's unlikely that we'll get any real fiscal stimulus from bringing cash back from overseas because the Congress is not going to pass any legislation that would make it possible to do that, in my view. So we've got an economic slowdown around the world. And I'd say one more problem is that China's growth is probably going to be slower than people have thought for some time. It grew at 10% a year for 30 years in a row. No other economy had ever done that. But it's now growing at probably mid-single-digit levels, and I suspect we'll see that for a while. And the economy is so big now, and they're such a big consumer of products from around the rest of the world, that's going to slow down production and sales from the rest of the world and exports from the rest of the world. So those are some of the problems I foresee as being ones we have to deal with. There are obviously solutions to them, but they're going to take a while before they get implemented.
Okay. So in an environment with near record high equity prices, are there industries that Carlyle is focusing on or that you think present an attractive investment opportunities, but no secrets?
Right, okay. Food ingredients is the number one, I think. To start to me, the single greatest area in which to invest in the world is carbon-related energy. Now, you may get to heaven more quickly investing in renewables, but I'm not sure you'll make a lot of money. Renewables require a heavy subsidy, and if oil prices are at $30 or $40 a barrel, I'm not sure the subsidy is going to be there or the rates of return will be there. But because we have carbon energy, and I'm not sure where the world would be if, depending on God or evolution, your point of view, suppose there was no oil or gas or coal on the face of the earth. It just didn't exist. Where would civilization be? Further ahead or further behind? Well, we might have developed better ways to do solar or wind or renewable, but we are where we are, and we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years with new techniques of oil and gas, and therefore it's a relatively cheap commodity. When you think about it, if you buy a gallon of Evian water, that is much more expensive than a gallon of gasoline, even though the gasoline comes from the Middle East, perhaps, and it's been refined and shipped and so forth. Oil is still relatively very cheap, and I think it's going to be our major source of energy for so many things for such a long time. Because the energy prices have come down to a greater degree than people thought, there's going to be an energy shock at some point, and the shock being that there's roughly $450 billion of corporate energy debt in the United States that's probably worth now about 65 cents on the dollar. And I think at some points it's going to be worth a lot less than that. So there's going to be great opportunities to buy companies in distress, buy debt in distress, and ultimately when the cycle comes back, as I suspect will happen in the year and a half, and oil prices come back, I think there'll be great opportunities to make a lot of money from those distressed purchases.
So why do you think it'll come back in a year and a half?
Well, if you look at history, the last time you saw oil go down as low as it did, and it went down as low as in the 80s to $7 a barrel, it took about 2 years to go from the peak to the trough to the peak again. And so it takes about 2 years, and I'd say 2 years is probably a pretty good estimate. It could be slightly longer, slightly shorter, but roughly 2 years should be what it takes. And now we're probably 6 months into that cycle, I would say. So I suspect it'll come back. Now, obviously today, everybody thinks that gasoline will stay very low and oil prices are not going to come back, but they surely will. And when ultimately when production, for example, production in the United States is going down because we're not doing a lot more shale oil, and consumption is going up. Everybody's buying SUVs because gasoline is so cheap. So ultimately, we'll have a demand and supply will come into more equilibrium. The uncertainty really is when OPEC nations will finally cut a deal that produces less oil, and also how much oil is floating around in the oceans. You may remember that when oil prices went down, people bought oil, put it in ship tanks or tankers, and they put it in tanks around the world, waiting for oil price to come up. Well, that oil is still floating around the world, and at some point it will have to be consumed. But when that's past us, I suspect you'll see oil prices coming back. And remember, the demand is spectacular. When I was born, there were 2.5 billion people on the face of the earth wanting energy. Now there are 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth, and as the emerging markets emerge, what they need is energy. And as they become the greatest growth engine in the world, they will consume more and more of this relatively inexpensive carbon energy. So I think the prices will absolutely come back.
So given all your successes, can you describe an investment that you did not make and wish you had?
How many hours do you have? Let me mention two of them to be very serious. My oldest daughter went to Harvard College, and you know, when your daughter goes to college or your son goes to college, you never know what they might come back with. But my daughter met a young man who was terrific. They're married, and he went to Phillips Exeter, Harvard College, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Business School. Very smart young man. In Phillips Exeter, his classmate was a young man that he wanted me to meet. He said this young man had a really good company, and he wanted me to maybe look at investing in it, knowing the business I was in. And I heard the company, and I said, companies that really deal with college-related things, they never make it, really. I've seen these things over the years, so I'm not really interested in meeting with them. That person's name is Mark Zuckerberg. The initial $10 million that was put in is today, if you held it, was probably worth $90 billion. So that was a mistake. Another one was this. We own a company called Baker & Taylor, which was the second largest book distributor in the United States. Started in 1839, had not made a profit since 1839, never made a profit. We bought it from W.R. Grace, and we're trying to figure out how to get new revenue from book distribution. And one day a salesman comes in a board meeting and says, I just found some idiot who is willing to buy our bibliography of books in print for a large amount of money, and this could be a new business. So I said, okay, so he's going to pay $500,000, $100,000 a year for 5 years. He said, by the way, I outsmarted this guy. He wanted to give me a third of this new company he was starting that's going to sell books over the internet, but I said, we're too smart for that. We want $100,000 a year for 5 years. Later, I figured out this was Jeff Bezos, and I went out to see him before he went public, and I said, you know, our salesman made a mistake. We'll take the third of the company now. He said, you know, I don't really need your bibliography as much as I did, but you were helpful, so I'm going to give you some stock in lieu of the $100,000 a year payment. So he gave us stock, which was 1% of the company. Today, it's worth about $3.5 billion. Unfortunately, we sold it at the IPO, and we didn't have confidence. So those were two of our big mistakes.
So what is your opinion on activist investors? I'm very interested in this.
Okay.
Do they help shareholders, or do they distract management for personal gain?
Well, the image of the private equity industry is not as great as I would like it to be. People run for president who've been in private equity, they get beat up. People don't like us that much. We're not that popular. I wish I could find the public relations people that have transformed the people that used to be called green mailers into today's activists. Today, there used to be the same people that were doing things that were considered very bad. You were holding up a company. You were trying to change the corporation's direction. Today, they're called activist investors, and everybody thinks they're wonderful. And so they've done a wonderful job of perfuming themselves a bit, but they've done some good value, and I know a lot of them, and I think they've done a pretty good job. I think that it is surprising to me that today an activist can show up and buy 1% of the company or less and get on the board, get board seats, and have a lot of influence, but that's clearly the way that we're going. I think they do add value. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that everything shouldn't be how a company's performance is next quarter or even next year, but a longer-term perspective is good. And to some extent, activists focus on the shorter term, but I think they've added some value. And I suspect that 5 years ago, everybody wanted to be coming out of business schools a private equity investor. I suspect in a few years, everybody want to come out and be an activist investor because the compensation can be quite good if you're very good at it, and some of them have done a very good job.
Okay. Now, I just want to talk for a few minutes about carried interest. I know you get this question a lot.
I couldn't hear you.
So profits for private equity fund managers that we call carried interest are taxed at more favorable capital gains versus ordinary income tax rates. and I know you told me I could ask you anything.
Sure.
You're in favor of reforming the tax code, and you've said you'd put everything on the table, even carried interest.
Right.
Why, or how do you think about this?
Let me describe, for those who obsess over my tax rate, let me explain what this is. The phrase carried interest actually comes from the Middle Ages. The ancient Venetian ship owners would send ships to get spices to Asia and bring them back. And the people that worked on the ship who were carrying back the spices, they got a carried interest. And it actually was 20% of the profits. And ultimately, when hedge funds and private equity funds were set up, they came to investors with a novel concept of giving them 20% of the profits, and ultimately the investors agreed to it because the returns were good, and that's still part of the industry. A law professor at the University of Illinois at the time, I think he's now at the University of San Diego, wrote an article several years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, pointing out in a law review article that the carried interest that I collect is taxed at the capital gains rate, not the ordinary rate, and he argued that it's really a fee for service. It should be taxed at the ordinary rate. He sent a copy to, I think, every member of Congress, and every member of Congress, really wasn't familiar with it. It got a lot of attention because private equity people were getting in the news for some things that they had done, and as a result, Congress passed, the House passed several times a bill to change it, but it never actually became law. I personally think that it's not quite an investment the way a capital gains kind of investment is, but you are taking risk and you are doing things that are different than just getting a salary. However, my view is the tax code is a bit of a mess. Nobody can understand it. How many people here fill out their own tax returns? Okay, all right. How many people in private equity fill out their own tax returns? Right. So it's very complicated to fill out your own tax returns. It's a very complicated system. And I think the system could use reform, and I think everything should be considered. Nothing should be off the table. I think the next Congress, not this Congress, but the next Congress, the next president, is likely to do it. It probably takes 2 or 3 years to have comprehensive tax reform. And when it occurs, I suspect everything will be on the table, and that's probably fair. But at the time being, I think we should recognize the fact that we are the center of the private equity world in the United States. It's been great for our economy, I believe, in our country. And I don't think that the amount of money that would be raised would be so significant that it would change the future of our country, because it's a relatively small amount. But I should also point out that the bulk of the money that is collected in carried interest and paid carried interest taxation is by the real estate industry. We're relatively small compared to the real estate industry, and probably the law hasn't changed because the real estate industry around the country has much more influence than private equity, and members of Congress tend to listen to the real estate industry. But everything should be on the table when Congress decides to take a look at comprehensive reform.
Well, do you think inversions are attracting an inordinate amount of focus, and is that fair, or is that just part of the whole tax code?
Well, clearly the tax code is driving people offshore. We have to do something about it. I think it's better to have U.S. companies staying in the United States, but when you have something where people feel compelled to go offshore and there's no real penalty for doing so, what are people expecting to happen? So I think it would be good if we could find a way to keep companies here. One of the reasons it's difficult to do this is that it's hard to get cash back into the United States. The money that's offshore can only be brought back in at the usual corporate tax rate, and we don't have a lower rate, it's not going to come back. But it's hard to have a lower rate because the budget in our country assumes the money will come back eventually at 40% tax rates. And so all the budget deficit numbers, which are more modest than they would otherwise be, have assumed the money is coming back at 40%. If they assumed it came back at 5 or 10%, the budget deficits would balloon. So it's a bit of a dilemma. I don't think Congress will deal with it anytime soon.
Okay, switching gears a little bit. In the category of time management, and I ask a lot of people this, can you tell us about an average day for you, and how do you manage to balance your role in private equity and all the nonprofits that you're involved in? How do you balance that?
Well, I'm very fortunate that I have pretty good health. I've never missed a day of work, never had an illness, never been in the hospital, nothing bad like that, though. You'll probably read I dropped dead of a heart attack tomorrow. But when you love what you're doing, it's not work. My mother, who's 85 years old, says, David, why don't you slow down and enjoy yourself? I say, I am enjoying what I'm doing. So she doesn't realize that when you're working on philanthropic things, you're running your company, you enjoy it. To me, it's not stress, it's pleasure. So I get up at roughly 5:30 in the morning and try to go a full day. And I'm typically making 2 or 3 speeches a day and do a lot of things for Carlyle, a lot of nonprofit things. But I'm doing nothing I don't want to do. Everything I'm doing, I want to do. And so it's pleasurable, and I don't really find it a challenge. I wish I had more time in the day, but I I generally extend my work week by treating Saturday and Sunday often like work days, so I do a lot of philanthropic things on those days.
I think we should get our mothers to meet each other, because then they
Okay.
can say that we work
All right.
too hard. So how do you make and sustain the one Carlyle culture? I saw the video
Right.
in an industry notorious for, eat what you kill, like the trader
Right,
mentality. How do you make it a cohesive team?
Well, the success of any organization is the culture. And we've tried to have a culture where everybody is participating, everybody is working together, and obviously not to have cliques and people bad-mouthing other people. When you have more and more people, it's harder and harder to do that. We have about 1,700 people in the core of the firm. While we have, many millions of people working in our companies, the core of the firm is about 1,700 people. And so we try very hard to bring them together, to educate them about our thought processes, and also try to lead from the top. Leadership is something that is very important, and I wouldn't say I'm a great leader, but I try to tell people and young students all the time, if you want to be a leader, you have to learn how to communicate and influence people. The most important thing is, leading by either example or by learning how to communicate orally or learning how to communicate by written means. And we try very hard to lead at our firm by example, so the senior people are working as hard as the younger people, and we're putting in the time to kind of make people think that putting in the time and working on a cohesive way is a good approach, but there's no perfect way to do it. The biggest problem organizations have is when the founders kind of step back, because there's a transition. And the founders of all the global private equity firms are largely still in the first generation. Which organization will have that culture that can be carried to the second generation and operate as well is unknown yet. Largely, there's some have had transition, but largely the best known ones have not had this transition. And we'll tell in 5 or 10 years which ones have inculcated their professionals with a culture such that the second generation can contain and continue the culture that made the firm successful.
Well, one of the things I know we were talking about at dinner was about the number of women in private equity, and I know I went on your website where you have a number of senior women in the firm and partners, but how can private equity increase the number of women? Is there some kind of cultural challenge there?
Obviously, we get our talent from investment banks or commercial banks, and they get theirs from the business schools. As the business schools have gone, my wife went to Harvard Business School, class of '78, and at that time there were probably 10% of the class was female. Now it's probably closer to 50%. My oldest daughter just graduated from Harvard Business School. I think it was probably 50%. So increasingly, as more and more people come out of the very good business schools and they go into financial firms, you will see more and more people rising up. But I do think you have to recognize that there's been some real problems with women rising up in hedge funds, private equity, investment banks, and there should be some changes, and we're trying to do some things in that direction, but we can always do more.
But as your firm have a leadership role in this? In other words, have you done better than other private equity firms?
I don't want to say that, because I'm sure somebody who is another private equity firm will say I'm wrong, but I think we have done a good job, but can always do better. We have some of the most senior women in private equity are in our firm, but we can always do better.
Now, one of the things you were talking about earlier was giving back to our country. Have you ever been concerned that if through philanthropy you give money, that it makes the government feel like they're off the hook, like with the Washington Monument?
Right.
Has that been an issue in your mind?
Well, whenever you give money away, you can always say, well, you should do something else with the money, or the money won't be well spent. And obviously, you can have lots of metrics to figure out whether the money was well spent. The biggest problem we have today is not that the U.S. government will all of a sudden say, we don't have to do certain things because private philanthropy is doing it, because there isn't that much private philanthropy helping in some of these areas, and the U.S. government cannot afford to do what it used to do. So many people here would say, take the Smithsonian. Many people here might say, well, the Smithsonian is funded by the federal government, but it's actually maybe 2/3 of the budget comes from the federal government, and the rest comes from private donations. And if we didn't have those private donations, the Smithsonian couldn't operate in the way it does now. The same is true of so many major institutions in Washington, D.C., and federal institutions. The National Park System, for example, has $11 billion of unfunded capital needs. That cannot all be funded by the federal government. We'll need philanthropy to do that. And I'm worried about many things, but not that the federal government will all of a sudden decide not to do certain things. I think the federal government will do what it can, but the private sector needs to recognize the federal government isn't going to be there anymore with the resources to fund some of these things.
So What are the most valuable lessons that you've learned from your life? You've talked about giving back, but when you think about business, being an entrepreneur, philanthropist, and I've heard you talk about chapters in your life. How do you think about when you look back?
Well, I try to tell young students when I meet with them. I often meet with Rhodes Scholars and White House Fellows and Supreme Court clerks, and I congratulate them. I said, you've won the first third of life. Great. I didn't win the first third. I wasn't a Rhodes Scholar, Supreme Court clerk, White House Fellow, and so I had to keep working hard. But you might be tempted in the first third of life, having been a White House Fellow, Supreme Court clerk, to just say, I can coast the rest of my life. If you do, you'll be working for somebody who didn't win the first third of their life, because ultimately you're going to be coasting. I've known some people with great first third of their life resumes, but then they give up. And I think life is the kind of thing where you get out of it what you put into it. And if you stop working very hard and stop trying to accomplish something in the second third or third third, you'll have a very, I think, unappetizing life. And so I try to convince people that they should continue to work hard throughout their life, but they should find something that they enjoy. As I said earlier, if you think what you're doing every day is boring and terrible, you shouldn't be doing it. You have to find something that you love doing. I didn't love practicing law, and law didn't love me. So I changed. I now love what I'm doing. And as I said earlier, nobody's won a Nobel Prize hating what they do. And nobody's ever done something great for humanity 9 to 5, 5 days a week. You have to love what you're doing. So I tell people and young students, experiment. Try different things. Don't listen to what your parents want you to do. If you do only what your parents want you to do, you'll be on a psychiatrist's couch for most of your life. Now, that may not be the worst thing in the world, but maybe not the best thing either. So my mother wanted me to be a dentist, and I told her repeatedly that I was afraid I was going to get arthritis in my fingers, so it wasn't a good profession for me to go into. She still thinks it's a better job than what I have now. Maybe it is, I don't know. But I think you have to find something you love and pursue it. And I also tell people that despite my kidding a bit about some of the things I've done and some of the kind things you said about me, I do think humility is an important virtue. When I talk to young people about the skills I want to see in people when I hire them, it is reasonable intelligence. I don't want geniuses, they're hard to manage. A really good work quotient, work ethic, somebody who wants to make money to do something useful with the money, not just to acquire lots of material goods. Somebody knows how to work as a team. Somebody knows how to communicate orally and by writing. Somebody that's willing to lead by example. Somebody has a high degree of ethical principles. And somebody who really wants to do something with their life that's meaningful so that when they get to the latter stage of life, they can say, yes, I've accomplished something that made the world a slightly better place. Those are the kind of people I'm looking for. And I also don't want to hire people who have all those skills if they're very arrogant and brag about it. I think humility is a great virtue, and sometimes some people in some professions don't remember that.
Well, if anybody fits those model, I'll be here for resumes after the meeting, so I agree. Now, you went to Duke, we talked about, in University of Chicago, and you've been generous and involved with each, been board of trustees. What drives you?
Not generous enough, they would say.
What drives you to remain connected with these schools, and what factors play the biggest role in the decisions that you make on how to invest in each? How do you think about that?
Well, my theory on higher education in the United States is really this, and I am involved with a number of schools that I didn't go to. My theory is, right or wrongly, that one of the great assets in the United States is American higher education. Our K-12 system is obviously flawed in many ways, but higher education system we have is the envy of the world. When I go around the world, people don't say to me, tell me how to run our government better because you run your government so well. They don't say to me, can you give us moral leadership? Because you have such great moral leadership in your country. They say to me, can you help me get my kid into University of Chicago or Harvard or Northwestern or Duke? Because what they want is higher education of the quality we have. And so I think if American higher education is going to be the envy of the world for the future and for a long time in the future, we should try to elevate American higher education by supporting it. And as we all know, private education cannot be sustained by tuition alone. You need philanthropy. And so I think one of our great assets in our country is our American higher education system, and it deserves support. And if we take the best universities like the University of Chicago and elevate it, other schools will up their game as well. So I think all of us should try to support the schools that we went to or our children went to. And they all gave us a great education, and they gave us scholarship money, and they made it possible for us to get where we are. So if I didn't get a scholarship to Duke, I didn't get a scholarship to the University of Chicago, I would not be here today, and so I'm very grateful, and I think I have an obligation to give back to it.
Good. Well, now you're president of the Economic Club of Washington, D.C., and we were comparing notes on how to really create value. Do you have any advice for our club here in Chicago, like smaller dinners?
Well, no. Look, Vernon Jordan was I think because people in Washington were envious of the Economic Club of Chicago and New York, 30 years ago they decided we should have an Economic Club of Washington. There wasn't a big business community, and it was set up, and a couple people ran it, but it was very small, and a lot of lobbyists and lawyers, maybe more than business leaders or CFOs or investors, because there wasn't many 30 years ago in Washington. Vernon Jordan was the immediate past president. He called me in his office one day and said, I want you to be the next chairman of this club. I said, I'm not even a member of the club. I don't even know what it does. And he said, you only have one job. Get 4 speakers a year, and that's it. Just line up 4 speakers. So I started to do that, and then I realized that most business people are very, very boring speakers, and they would put our members to sleep. And so our motto was you had the person speak, and then questions from the audience would come up, and I was supposed to give them and ask the questions. The questions from the audience were even worse than the speeches, so I didn't answer the questions. I just made up my own questions. And so I asked questions, I elicited some laughter, and people said, that's funny. So I decided from now on, no more speeches, and I only interview people. And so that's, it tends to work out. Next week I have Ben Bernanke. This week I had Ash Carter, and I hope I someday can get the President of the United States, maybe around the same time that he comes here.
Well, I know we're competing for some of these speakers.
I'm sure he has plenty.
He can do both.
He'll have time, but we try to get a lot of speakers and we interview them, and I think you've done a very good job, and I am honestly stunned that this many people would come to listen to me. So I assumed there was a car raffle tonight or something was going to happen. They were giving away something, or I don't know what it was, because I don't think I could, in Washington, D.C., I couldn't draw this big a crowd. I don't think even my mother going to Palm Beach and telling all her friends to show up couldn't get this big a crowd for me.
I'd be surprised. Actually, sometimes United Airlines gives us tickets to give away.
It might be. I don't know. So.
Okay. Now, one of the things I found interesting to finish up here is that outside, I heard you have a vacation home in Nantucket, that you don't get there that often, but there's supposedly a rock with the words painted on it, I'd rather be working. Right. So can you comment on that? Did you paint that, or is that how you think?
Well, somebody gave it to me, but I'm not famous for relaxing, or, I just feel, well, I guess my theory is that I see a lot of people relaxing and then they drop dead of a heart attack, and sometimes I have a theory that if you keep going forward, your adrenaline will keep pumping. And if I relax, all of a sudden, the inside of my body, the nerves will relax, everything will relax, and a germ will come in and see a relaxed nervous system. So I don't want to relax. I'm afraid if I go to the beach, all of a sudden, then my system will just relax, and germs can come in and attack a weak system. So I keep going forward, and I don't want to slow down. But I love what I'm doing, and if I'm sitting in Nantucket for a week, I would probably go crazy and probably would have a heart attack.
Well, it seems to be working.
So far, you never know. As there was a lawyer from Chicago who was once the chairman of the SEC, and he famously said something along the lines of, I get most of my exercise being the pallbearer at the funerals of friends of mine who exercise. So now I have a very unusual exercise program. In my homes, I have in a couple of homes, I have elaborate exercise equipment. It's industrial strength, it's great. And I have the theory that there's exercise by osmosis. If I walk past this equipment enough, it'll rub off. And so far, I haven't been injured, or so far, nothing bad has happened. So I think it works.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you again, David.
All right, thank you.
We appreciate your being here.
All right, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.